4 days after these crucial incidents, a funeral started from Canterville Chase at about 11 o'clock at night. The hearse, which means a carriage that carries a coffin, was drawn by 8 black horses, each of which carried on its head a great tuft, which means cluster of hair, of nodding ostrich plumes, which means feather. And the leaden coffin was covered by a rich purple pall, which means cloth spread over a coffin, on which was embroidered in gold the Canterville coat of arms. By the side of the hearse and the coaches walked the servant with lighted torches, and the whole procession was wonderfully impressive. Lord Canterville was the chef mourner, having come up specially from Wales to attend the funeral, and sat in the first carriage along with little Virginia. Then came the United States Minister and his wife, then Washington and the 3 boys, and in the last carriage was Mrs. Umney. It was generally felt that, as she had been frightened by the ghost for more than 50 years of her life, she had a right to see the last of him. A deep grave had been dug in the corner of the churchyard, just under the old yew tree, and the service was read in the most impressive manner by the Augustin Dampier. When the ceremony was over, the servants, according to an old custom observed in the Canterville family, extinguished their torches, and as the coffin was being lowered into the grave, Virginia stepped forward and laid on it a large cross made of white and pink almond blossom. As she did so, the moon came out from behind a cloud and flooded with its silent silver the little churchyard. And from a distant cause, which means small group of trees, a nightingale began to sing. She thought of the ghost description of Garden of Death. Her eyes became dim with tears, and she hardly spoke a word during the drive home. The next morning, before Lord Canterville went up to town, Mr. Otis had an interview with him on the subject of the jewels the ghost had given to Virginia. They perfectly magnificence, especially a certain ruby necklace with old Venetian settings, which was a really super specimen of 16th century work. And their value was so great that Mr. Otis felt considerable circumstance, which means uneasy feeling of conscience, about allowing his daughter to accept them. The Lord, he said, I know that in this country, mortmain, which means legal ownership of land, is held to apply to trinkets, which means expensive ornaments, as well as to land. And it is quite clear to me that these jewels are, or should be, which means inextricable in your family. I must beg you, accordingly, to take them to London with you, and to regard them simply as a portion of your property which has been resorted to you under certain strange conditions. As for my daughter, she is merely a child, and and has as yet, I am glad to say, but little interest in such addition of idle luxury. I am also informed by Mrs. Otis, who, I must say, is no mean authority upon art, having had the privilege of spending several winters in Brisbane when she was a girl, that these gems are of great monetary worth, and it often for sale would fetch a toll price. Under these circumstances, Lord Canterville, I feel sure that you will recognize how impossible it would be for me to allow them to remain in the possession of any member of my family. And indeed, all such vain guards and toys, however suitable or necessary to the dignity of the British aristocracy, would be completely out of place among those who have been brought up on this earth, and I believe immortal. Principle of republican simplicity. Perhaps I should mention that Virginia is very anxious that you should allow her to retain the box as a memento of you unfortunate but misguided guest, as it is extremely old and consequently a good deal out of repair. You may perhaps think fit to comply, which means obey, with her request. For my own part, confess I am a good deal surprised to find a child of mine expressing sympathy with medievism in any form, and can only account for it by the fact that Virginia was born in one of year London, which means residential area outside the major city, shortly after Mrs. Otis has returned from a trip to Athens. Lord Canterville listened very gravely to the worthy minister's speech, pulling his grey moustache now and then to hide an involuntary smile. And when Mr. Otis had ended, he shook him cordially by the hand and said, "My dear sir, your charming little daughter rendered my unlucky ancestor, Sir Simon, a very important service, and I and my family are such in debt, which means grateful to her for her marvelous courage, and plugs, which means determination. The jewels are clearly hers and I believe that if I were heartless enough to take them from her, the wicked old fellow would be out of his grave in a fortnight, leading me the devil of a life. As for their being heirlooms, nothing is an heirlooms that is not so mentioned in a will or legal document, and the existence of these jewels has been quite unknown. I assure you I have no more claim on them than you butler. When Mrs. Virginia grows up, I dare say she will be pleased to have pretty things to wear besides you forget, Mrs. Otis, that you took the furniture and the host at a valuation, and anything that belonged to the host passed at once. You should possession as whatever activity Sir Simon may you show in the corridor at night. In point of law, he was really dead, and you acquire his property by purchase. Mr. Otis was a good deal distressed at Lord Canterville's refusal and begged him to reconsider his decision. But the good natured peer, which means member of the nobility, was quite firm, and finally persuaded the minister to allow his daughter to retain the present the host had given her. And when, in the spring of 1819, the young Duchess of Cherries was presented at the Queen's first drawing room on the occasion of her marriage, her jewels were the universal theme of admiration. For Virginia received the crown made of flowers, which is the reward of all good little American girls, and was married to her boy lover as soon as he came of age. They were both so charming and they loved each other so much that everyone was delighted to the match, except the old Marchioness of Dumbleton, who had tried to catch the Duke for one of her 7 unmarried daughters, and had given no less than 3 expensive dinner parties for that purpose. And strange to say, Mr. Otis was extremely fond of the young Duke's personality, but theoretically he objected to titles, and, to use his own words, was not without apprehensive lest, I mind the enwaiting, which means that the weakens one's character, influence of a pleasure loving aristocracy, the true principle of republican simplicity should be forgotten. His objectives, however, were completely overruled, and I believe that when he walked up the slides of St. George in Hanover Square, with his daughter leaning on his arm, there was not a prouder man in the whole length and breadth of England. The Duke and Duchess, after the honeymoon was over, went down to Canterville Chase, and on the day after their arrival, they walked over in the afternoon to the lonely churchyard by the pine woods. There had been a great deal of difficulty at first about the inscription, which means words cut at store on Sir Simon tombstone, but finally it had been decided to engrave on it simply the initial of the old gentleman's names, and the words from the library window, the Duchess, and brought with her some lovely roses, which she threw upon the grave, and after they had stood by it for some time, they strolled into the ruined part of the church of the old large church. There the Duchess sat down on a fallen pillar, while her husband lay at her feet smoking a cigarette and looking up at sorry, and looking up at her beautiful eyes. Suddenly, he threw his cigarette away, took hold of her hands, and said to her, Virginia, a wife should have no secrets from her husband. Dear Cecil, I have no secret from you. Yes, you have, he answered smiling. You have never told me what happens to you when you are locked up with the ghost. I never told anyone, Cecil, said Virginia gravely. I know that, but you might tell me. Please don't ask me, Cecil. I can't tell you. Poor Sir Simon. I owe him a great deal. Yes, I don't laugh, Cecil. I really do. He made me see what is life and what death signifies. Why love is stronger than both. Duke roses and kissed his wifely lovely. You can have your secret as long I have your heart, he murmured. You always had that, Cecil, and you will tell our children someday, won't you? Virginia blushed.